Imagine waking before dawn to the roar of 3 million invaders. Hitler's army storming the Soviet Union in the largest surprise attack the world has ever seen. He promised Moscow would fall in weeks. But what followed was a nightmare of mud, ice, and a counterstrike that would shatter Nazi Germany's dream forever. Summer of 1941 draped Europe in uneasy silence. From the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, a single shadow stretched Nazi Germany at the height of its power. France had fallen in a matter of weeks, the Balkans lay crushed, and Hitler's banners fluttered over conquered capitals. Yet for Adolf Hitler, victory in the West was only the beginning. His gaze turned east, to the vast Soviet Union, a land he derided as Bolshevik, yet coveted for its oil fields, wheat, and the living space Lebensraum that he believed destiny owed to the German people. In Berlin, a plan of staggering audacity took shape. It was codenamed Operation Barbarossa, after the medieval emperor who once sought to dominate Europe. The objective was as bold as it was brutal: annihilate the Red Army in a lightning campaign, capture Moscow before the bitter Russian winter, and shatter the Soviet state in a single season. 3 massive army groups would spearhead the invasion, north toward Leningrad, south toward the breadbasket of Ukraine, and a central thrust aimed straight at Moscow. On the Soviet side, warnings trickled in, but Joseph Stalin refused to believe that Germany would break their non-aggression pact so soon. Soviet troops remained scattered and unprepared, their defenses stretched thin across a border thousands of kilometers long. Before dawn on June 22, 1941, the silence broke. Along nearly 2,000 miles of frontier, the earth erupted under the thunder of artillery. German tanks surged forward, aircraft screamed overhead, and millions of soldiers poured into Soviet territory. The greatest invasion in human history had begun, a gamble that would decide the fate of nations and set the stage for one of the most savage struggles the world had ever seen. At 3:15 a.m. on Sunday, June 22, 1941, the eastern horizon flared white. German artillery unleashed a deafening roar along a front nearly 2,000 miles long, from the icy Baltic shores to the Black Sea. Moments later, the sky filled with the drone of more than 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft. Soviet radio operators, stunned by the sudden static of jam signals, barely had time to react before bombs rained down on airfields, command posts, and rail hubs. The quiet dawn dissolved into chaos. This was Operation Barbarossa in motion, a meticulously orchestrated assault of staggering scale. Hitler's war machine hurled over 3.8 million soldiers, 3,500 tanks, and 600,000 motor vehicles into the Soviet Union, in the largest invasion force the world had ever witnessed. Their goal was breathtakingly ambitious: to cripple the Red Army in weeks, conquer European Russia, and seize Moscow before winter's first frost. The attack unfolded in 3 colossal thrusts. Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, slashed through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the mightiest force under Fedor von Bock, drove towards Smolensk and the Soviet capital itself. To the south, Army Group South, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, stormed across the rich farmlands of Ukraine and aimed to capture Kiev. Each spearhead moved with machine-like precision, combining relentless tank assaults with swift infantry advances and Luftwaffe dominance overhead, a classic demonstration of blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Caught off guard, Soviet defenses buckled. Entire border garrisons were overwhelmed before orders could be relayed. At Bialystok and Minsk, German panzer divisions encircled tens of thousands of Soviet troops within days, turning the countryside into a cauldron of fire and smoke. Columns of bewildered Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner, sometimes entire regiments at a time, while wrecked tanks and burning aircraft littered the roadsides. In the first 24 hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed more than 1,000 Soviet planes, many still lined up wingtip to wingtip on their runways. Communications collapsed. Commanders struggled to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe unfolding across their vast frontier. Stalin, stunned and disbelieving, hesitated to issue a full mobilization, fearing the attack might be a provocation or a limited strike, but there was nothing limited about it. The German juggernaut surged forward up to 30 miles a day, slicing through forests and farmland like a sharpened blade. Civilians fled in terror as towns were consumed by fire, and the thunder of advancing panzers echoed through the countryside. By nightfall on June 22nd, the Soviet Union faced an existential nightmare. In less than a single day, Hitler's gamble had unleashed a tempest of steel and fire that threatened to tear the heart out of the world's largest nation, a blow so sudden and ferocious it seemed nothing could halt its momentum. The days that followed the initial assault revealed the terrifying efficiency of Hitler's blitzkrieg, lightning war, in its purest form. The strategy fused speed, surprise, and coordination into a single, unstoppable weapon. Fast-moving panzer divisions spearheaded deep thrusts, bypassing strongpoints and cutting communications, while dive-bombing Stuka squadrons screamed overhead, pulverizing rail junctions and troop concentrations. Behind the armored spearheads rumbled motorized infantry, sealing off pockets of Soviet defenders before they could regroup. The first great test came at the Białystok-Minsk pocket, a vast region of forests and rolling farmland where the Red Army had attempted to form a defensive line. By late June, General Heinz Guderian's and Hermann Hoff's panzer groups executed a textbook double envelopment. They met east of Minsk, slamming the door on more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Luftwaffe bombers raked the trapped forces while artillery pounded them into submission. In less than a week, 4 entire Soviet armies ceased to exist. The road to the Dnieper River lay open, but the German advance did not pause. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the 3 spearheads, surged towards Smolensk, a critical gateway to Moscow. Soviet commanders threw fresh units into the fray, desperately trying to delay the onslaught. Here, the Red Army's stubborn resistance bought precious time. From early July to early August, the Battle of Smolensk raged across a broad front. Despite being encircled repeatedly, Soviet forces fought tenaciously, inflicting heavier German casualties than expected and slowing the relentless drive east. Meanwhile, Army Group North carved through the Baltic states with breathtaking speed. In a matter of weeks, German armor crossed the Daugava River and threatened Leningrad, sowing panic among civilians as cities like Riga and Tallinn fell. To the south, Army Group South struck deep into Ukraine, engaging in a brutal contest for control of the rich grain fields and industrial centers. Battles around Dubno and Brody saw some of the largest tank clashes of the early war, with thousands of armored vehicles clashing in chaotic, fiery melees. Though the Soviets suffered staggering losses, these fierce engagements forced the Germans to fight harder and longer than they had anticipated. The numbers were staggering. By mid-July, the Red Army had lost more than 10,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and nearly 1 million men killed, wounded, or captured. Columns of Soviet prisoners, gaunt, dust-covered, and bewildered, stretched for miles along the roads westward. Entire divisions vanished in cauldrons of smoke and steel. Yet, astonishingly, the Soviet state did not collapse. Stalin, now fully awake to the magnitude of the invasion, ordered total war and rallied the nation, not one step back. For the Wehrmacht, the early weeks seemed to confirm the myth of German invincibility. Panzer formations advanced up to 30 miles a day, often so quickly that supply trucks struggled to keep pace. Town after town fell to the thunder of treads and the wail of Stukas. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the map of Europe appeared to be rewritten in a matter of days. But beneath the triumph lay the first hints of strain. The vast distances of the Soviet Union stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Soviet resistance, though costly, was stiffening. And every mile the Germans pushed east carried them deeper into a land where sheer size, harsh climate, and a determined enemy would soon begin to turn speed into vulnerability. The lightning war still flashed brilliantly, but the storm clouds of a longer struggle were already gathering on the horizon. The German High Command expected the Soviet Union to break within weeks. Instead, the invasion lit a fire beneath a nation that refused to die. By mid-July 1941, despite catastrophic losses, the Red Army and the Soviet people began to harden into a force of stubborn defiance. Joseph Stalin, stunned into silence in the first chaotic days, now found his voice. On July 3rd, he addressed the nation by radio. His words carried across a crackling ether from the Baltic to the Pacific. Comrades, our war is a patriotic war. The enemy is cruel and must be destroyed. Not one step back. Factories in the threatened Western territories were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and shipped thousands of kilometers east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Within weeks, the remote Ural Mountains and Siberian plains echoed with the clang of new assembly lines, a feat of industrial relocation unmatched in history. On the front lines, resistance stiffened. Retreating units fought desperate rearguard actions along every river and ridge, trading space for time. Engineers blew bridges and torched rail yards to deny the invaders supplies. Villagers burned their own crops and livestock rather than feed the enemy. What Hitler dismissed as a collapsing Asiatic colossus revealed a grim, organized will to survive. Local counterattacks erupted with startling ferocity. Around Yartsevo near Smolensk, Soviet tank brigades lunged at General Guderian's flanks, forcing German armor to pause and regroup. In the Kiev sector, nimble partisan bands struck at night, ambushing supply columns and severing telegraph lines before melting back into forests and swamps. Though these actions rarely reclaimed large territories, they inflicted unexpected casualties and disrupted the relentless rhythm of blitzkrieg. For the first time, the Wehrmacht felt the strain. German commanders complained of lengthening supply lines, ambushes, and a foe who refused to admit defeat. Each day of delay meant more Red Army reserves arriving from the vast interior, and the calendar sliding toward the dreaded Russian winter. The early illusion of a swift, surgical conquest was crumbling. The Soviet Union, though bleeding, had not only survived the opening shock, but was beginning to hit back. These scattered but fierce counterblows signaled a new phase of the campaign. The lightning war was slowing, and the invaders were discovering that the colossus they sought to topple was far stronger and far more determined than they had ever imagined. By late summer 1941, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. German forces had driven hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing vast swaths of land and taking millions of prisoners. Yet beneath the glitter of early victories, cracks were widening, cracks born of strategic overconfidence and Hitler's own meddling. The original plan for Operation Barbarossa called for a direct thrust toward Moscow, the nerve center of Soviet administration and transport. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center was poised to deliver the decisive blow. But as August waned, Hitler's ambitions began to drift. Obsessed with resources and prestige targets, he ordered critical panzer divisions to peel away from the central advance. Some were diverted north to tighten the noose around Leningrad. Others swung south to seize the fertile farmlands and industrial riches of Ukraine. This fateful decision fractured the momentum of the campaign. While Guderian's tanks turned south, the Red Army gained precious weeks to reinforce the approaches to Moscow. Still, the diversions produced brutal battles of their own. In the north, Army Group North encircled Leningrad by September, initiating a siege that would last nearly 900 days and cost over 1 million civilian lives. German troops cut rail lines and blockaded the city, but instead of the quick capitulation Hitler expected, Leningrad dug in. Soviet defenders and civilians endured starvation and shelling, holding out against all odds. Farther south unfolded the colossal Battle of Kiev. In a masterstroke of maneuver warfare, German forces executed a double envelopment, trapping 4 Soviet armies, over 600,000 soldiers, in a tightening steel ring. It was one of the largest encirclements in military history, a tactical triumph that thrilled Berlin but consumed time and manpower. Weeks passed as the Wehrmacht crushed resistance and processed prisoners, while summer faded toward autumn. These diversions stretched supply lines to the breaking point. German logistics, already strained by the vast distances of the Soviet Union, buckled under the demands of multiple major offensives. Fuel convoys lagged far behind fast-moving panzers. Rail gauges had to be converted from Soviet to European standards, slowing the transport of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. By the time Hitler refocused on Moscow with Operation Typhoon in early October, the opportunity for a swift, decisive strike had slipped away. The Red Army, battered but reorganized, stood stronger, bolstered by new divisions arriving from the Urals and Siberia. What had begun as a lightning campaign was now a race against an approaching Russian winter. A race the Germans were already losing. Hitler's decision to divide his forces marked the turning point of the invasion. Tactical brilliance on the battlefield could not compensate for strategic hubris. The drive that had begun with thunderous momentum was slowing, and the seeds of eventual German defeat were taking root in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union. By early October 1941, Hitler sought to reclaim lost momentum with Operation Typhoon, the final push to seize Moscow and end the campaign before winter. Army Group Center, reinforced with elite panzer divisions recalled from the northern and southern fronts, lunged eastward once more. German generals believed the Soviet capital would fall within weeks. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. Initially, the offensive roared forward. At Vyazma and Bryansk, German panzers executed sweeping encirclements, capturing or killing more than 500,000 Red Army soldiers. Roads to Moscow lay open. Berlin exulted. Newspapers proclaimed that the Soviets were finished. German troops advanced up to 30 miles a day, confident they would march through Red Square before the year's end. But the Soviet Union had other plans. Stalin ordered the defense of Moscow at all costs. Fresh divisions from Siberia, hardened by Arctic conditions and equipped for cold weather, poured into the capital's defenses. Civilians joined soldiers to dig anti-tank ditches and build barricades. The city braced itself for a siege. Then nature itself struck. In mid-October, the Russian autumn unleashed its infamous Rasputitsa, a deluge of cold rain that turned the unpaved roads into seas of mud. The ground, neither fully frozen nor dry, became a treacherous swamp. German tanks and trucks, designed for Europe's highways, sank axle-deep. Soldiers and horses struggled to drag artillery through the mire. Supply convoys slowed to a crawl. Fuel and ammunition often arrived days late, if at all. For the advancing Wehrmacht, the quagmire was a nightmare. Engines overheated or stalled, boots were sucked from feet, and equipment rusted in the relentless damp. Exhausted troops, already suffering from dwindling rations, were forced to sleep in waterlogged trenches as icy rain soaked their uniforms. What was meant to be a swift autumn thrust evolved into a grueling slog measured in yards, not miles. The Red Army seized the opportunity. Soviet counterattacks harried German flanks, striking isolated spearheads mired in mud. Partisan fighters sabotaged supply lines and ambushed stalled convoys. The defenders of Moscow, buoyed by Stalin's fiery speeches and the knowledge that the invader was faltering, dug in deeper. By late October, the German advance had slowed to a crawl barely 60 miles from the Kremlin spires. The once feared blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was extinguished in a morass of mud and misery. When the first icy winds of November swept across the steppe, soldiers whispered of an even greater menace approaching, the full fury of the Russian winter. What had begun as a dash for Moscow now hung suspended in muck and cold, a grim foreshadowing of the disaster to come. As November 1941 bled into December, the German High Command faced a brutal truth. The Blitzkrieg had stalled just outside Moscow. The temperature plummeted far below anything the Wehrmacht had ever experienced, nights of -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, turned rifles brittle and froze engine oil into sludge. Soldiers, still wearing thin autumn uniforms, wrapped themselves in burlap, newspapers, and stolen blankets. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Entire sentries were found frozen upright at their posts. Supply lines, already strained, became a nightmare. Fuel froze in jerrycans, and trucks refused to start. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, died in droves. Ammunition arrived late or not at all. Panzer engines roared only after hours of frantic heating with bonfires. The once mighty German war machine ground down to a crawl, stalled by a foe as merciless as any Soviet gun, the Russian winter itself. Inside Moscow, the mood was equally desperate, but far from broken. Civilians labored around the clock to strengthen defenses, digging trenches through frozen soil, erecting barricades of timber and steel. Stalin refused to flee. From the Kremlin he rallied his people, declaring, "Moscow will not fall." His gamble paid off. Reinforcements well-trained, cold-weather Siberian divisions freed from the Far East after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack arrived in the nick of time. These troops brought white camouflage, felt boots, and the experience of fighting in subarctic conditions. On the 5th of December 1941, with the Germans exhausted and frostbitten, the Red Army struck back. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive along a 200-mile front. Waves of Siberian ski troops and T-34 tanks, their wide tracks perfectly suited for snow, crashed into German lines. The surprise was total. German units, already weakened by hunger and cold, reeled under the assault. Entire divisions were forced into chaotic retreat. The counterattack did more than recapture territory. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. Villages and towns that had fallen in the summer now saw Red Army flags raised once more. German soldiers stumbled back from the very gates of Moscow, abandoning weapons and equipment in the deepening snow. Hitler raged, issuing no retreat orders that only deepened the losses. By early January 1942, the Wehrmacht had been driven 100 to 150 miles from the capital. The dream of a swift conquest of the Soviet Union lay buried beneath the snowdrifts. Operation Barbarossa, conceived as a lightning war to crush the USSR in months, had instead become a grinding war of attrition. The Russian winter and the Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow marked the first major strategic defeat of Nazi Germany. From this frozen turning point, the Eastern Front would become a brutal, years-long struggle one the Reich could no longer hope to win. Operation Barbarossa ended not with a triumphant German parade through Red Square, but with a battered Wehrmacht reeling from the snows outside Moscow. By early 1942, Hitler's grand gamble had failed. The invasion that was meant to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks had instead cost the German army over 750,000 casualties killed, wounded, or captured, along with tens of thousands of vehicles and aircraft. Entire divisions were reduced to skeletons of their former strength. For the Soviet Union, the cost was even more staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians dead or displaced, entire cities reduced to rubble, and vast stretches of territory under occupation. Yet the Red Army remained unbroken. The survival of Moscow preserved the Soviet government and the industrial heartland beyond the Urals. Crucially, factories relocated eastward during the early chaos were now producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at a pace that would soon outstrip Germany's capacity. Militarily, Barbarossa shattered the illusion of German invincibility. The Blitzkrieg, so effective in Poland and France, proved unsustainable against the Soviet Union's vast distances, relentless manpower, and brutal climate. Hitler's decision to split his forces and delay the drive on Moscow exposed a fatal weakness: strategic hubris. By underestimating Soviet resilience and overextending supply lines, Germany lost the initiative it would never fully regain. The failure also reshaped the global conflict. Britain, previously standing largely alone in Europe, gained a powerful Eastern ally that would tie down the bulk of the German army for the rest of the war. In December 1941, as the Moscow counteroffensive gathered strength, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. A truly global alliance was forming against the Axis. Operation Barbarossa thus became, more than a campaign, it was a turning point. Germany's dream of a swift victory in the East died in the frozen mud outside Moscow, and the long, grinding struggle on the Eastern Front began. From this moment forward, Nazi Germany faced a war it could not win, and the Soviet Union emerged as the immovable force that would ultimately drive the Reich back to Berlin.